Hi, everybody. This is SAAD for the SAAD Truth. Many of you who've been following my work for a while know that I've been tackling the campus lunacy that you see today for many years now. So, if you remember back in 2002, I've recounted the following story. I was having an exchange with a postmodernist cultural anthropologist, radical feminist woman, and I suggested to her at the time that only women could bear children, to which she was astonished by my sexism and said that there is a Japanese tribe off some island wherein within their spiritual realm it is the men who bear children. And so I was a grotesque, sexist, pig, because I was restraining the conversation to the biological realm. When you look at it from the spiritual realm, it's not true that it is only women who bear children. And then I retorted that, okay, what about when it comes to, say, from any vantage point on Earth, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west? Is this not something that sailors could rely on since time immemorial? There she used the deconstructionism game, whereby she said she doesn't label things. What do I mean by east and west? That which I call the sun, she calls dancing hyena. And so there you have it. So, of course, this was 16 years ago, and it perfectly captures the lunacy of postmodernism and related intellectual terrorism. Now, fast forward to 2014, I had just given a invited lecture at Wellesley College, and after my lecture, some students and faculty members had stayed back to chat, and one student in particular was engaging me, and she was arguing that it was perfectly reasonable to expect for professors to poll their students at the start of class regarding their gender identities and how they wish to be addressed and so on. And this was several years before the eventual gender pronoun issue really broke through to the public conscience. But in any case, today I'd like to talk about another example of a current lunacy that I faced many years ago. This is now a story that I'm going to recount for you from back in 2008. And it's the first time, as far as I can remember, that I've actually mentioned this story. It relates to the anti-whiteness, white supremacy, white guilt, white privilege nonsense that we're now seeing. Most recently, there was a It's Okay to Be Against Anti-Whiteness event at Trent University in Canada, but there have been many, many others such events. And so I had actually faced this grotesque racism back in 2008. It was in the context of my reviewing a paper for a very well-known journal. Now, as you know, peer reviews are typically double blind. The authors don't know the reviewers don't know the authors, and this was certainly the case here. But I'm more than happy now to identify that I was the reviewer of the said review that I'm about to read. And if the authors were to ever watch this clip, ta-da! But in any case, there might be one or two places where I won't mention something in reading my review, lest it might have a minuscule chance of identifying who they are. Now, of course, there's almost no chance that you could have ever identified who they are based on what I'm going to read here. And incidentally, their best outcome would have been that the paper was eventually published, in which case everybody would know who they are. But I will stick to the strictest protocol and just edit out any information that I think could in any way identify who I might have been talking about in this paper. Just to give you the background to the paper before I actually read it, the paper basically measured white privilege, how much you believe in white privilege, how much do you believe that the things that have led you to who you are due to your white privilege, and so do you also experience white guilt? Do you experience male guilt? And if you say yes to those things, then they were hoping to show, and apparently they showed they they showed that if you experience or if you admit to your white privilege, then you're more likely to, if you like, be less prejudicial. Uh, the male guilt part was a bit more, the story was a bit more complicated, but the bottom line is that they're arguing you have to self-flagellate in admitting that you benefit from white privilege, and you must experience white guilt and hopefully male guilt. And that's really your only redemption to not being a racist rabid pig. Otherwise, of course, all hope is lost and you're effectively a KKK member. So the paper was so grotesque, it was so nonsensical, it was so offensive, that this is the review that I had penned. So here we go. I won't read for you. I'll read my general review, the specific details where I break out specific points on specific pages. That's too tedious. It's not really relevant to read here. So here we go. I wish to be as diplomatic as is humanly possible whilst writing this review. I apologize ahead of time should I fail in my quest to temper my reactions to this paper. Let me begin at the outset by stating that I have never read a more offensive, quote, academic manuscript. By the way, I won't state all of the places where I'm putting quotes because it might be tedious. If there has ever been a telling example of racism and sexism, it is contained within the body of this paper. Let me start with the label white. I happen to be a Jew from the Middle East possessing olive skin, which becomes much darker when exposed to the sun. Technically speaking, I am a Semitic, and hence, in some nomenclatures, I would be considered non-white. That said, in most American diversity surveys, I would be considered white. Correction now, update. We now know that I'm a brown person, I'm a person of color. By the way, you don't have to be from the Middle East the way I am with my heritage to become a person of color. You could be Linda Sarsour, a white girl who then dons the hijab, and then she becomes a person of color. That's the way the game is played. Accordingly, should I be experiencing white guilt or do I get a free pass? Let us push this analysis a bit further. One would assume that white guilt is due to the racist treatment that some whites have conferred and continue to confer on black Americans. Are all people who currently reside in the United States and who possess white pigmentation equally guilty? Is the Croatian white single mother who moved to the United States to escape the Balkan Wars equally guilty in her whiteness, as is the redneck racist young man who is a member of the Ku Klux Klan? Is the white slave owner as guilty as his descendants, assuming that both he and his descendants are fully white, quote, fully white? Does one have to come from a family of slave owners to experience guilt, or does merely being white cause you to experience guilt? Does one experience white guilt if the father is white and the mother is black, or do they only experience half-white guilt? It would appear, according to the author, that in the same way that Jews could not escape their Jewish identities during the Holocaust, no white person can wipe away the stain of his or her skin pigmentation. As such, all whites, including fifth-generation Swedes, first-generation Russians, dark-skinned Italian Americans of the Sicilian descent, and white races from the Deep South are all lumped together by virtue of sharing a spectrum of white pigmentation. It is unbearable to read such offensive and racist nonsense. By the way, there are endless historical instances wherein blacks have been homicidal, if not genocidal, in their treatments of fellow blacks. Example, the recent cases of Rwanda, Darfur, and Zimbabwe. And by the way, there are many cases where blacks were very racist and homicidal towards whites. Think about some of what's happening to white farmers in Zimbabwe and South Africa as we speak. Should African Americans be experiencing black guilt over these incidents, or would it be racist of me to ask this question? What if the Turkish genocide of Armenians in 1915? Assuming that a Turkish American family has resided in the United States for several generations, should they experience white guilt for the Armenian genocide or for their support of the American system of white privilege? Finally, should contemporary Japanese people experience Asian guilt as a result of the Nanjing massacre of 1937-1938? I nearly fell off my chair when I read the items of the, and I won't read the name of the scale. It's basically a scale that measures, do you believe that there is such a thing as white privilege? It would appear that there is no such thing as personal merit if you are white, because apparently everything, by the way, if you're successful and you're white, ultimately it must be due to you having benefited from the white system. Failure to acknowledge that one's achievements as a white person are due to the corresponding subjugation of blacks implies, according to the scale in question, that one is failing to recognize white privilege. Not surprisingly, the author then finds that those who fail to recognize white privilege were more likely to be racist and less likely to support diversity programs. There you go, as I mentioned earlier. Suppose that a Russian student obtained her undergraduate degree at Moscow State University. She then comes to the United States and obtains her doctorate at Harvard. Throughout her education, she was a top student. Should she attribute her success whilst in Russia to her intelligence and hard work, but attribute part of her success in the United States to her, quote, implicit subjugation of blacks, close quotes, and the white privilege that she benefited from? Frankly, it is difficult to stomach such racist nonsense. Let me briefly address the two guilt measures, white guilt and male guilt. Can you imagine how outrageous and offensive such supposed measures are? I'm trying to understand how measuring one's supposed guilt at being of a particular shade of pigmentation is not racist. It is the epitome of racism. Do you truly believe that I wake up in the morning, look at my olive skin, which is considered white according to the guidelines of affirmative action? By the way, that's no longer the case because now there is I think a box that says you're Middle Eastern, and so you avoid the gross appellation of being white. And accordingly experience guilt. The implicit premises in this paper are as virulently racist as the countless anti-Semitic rants that I have been exposed to in my personal life. Now let me state a few words about male guilt. I'm having a hard time imagining a more sexist assumption than to assume that one should feel guilty by virtue of their biological sex. Is the author aware that Homo sapiens are a sexually reproducing species? Is the author suggesting that one of the two sexes of a sexually reproducing species should feel existential guilt? Should all white men head off to a 12-step program of re-education wherein they seek to cleanse themselves of the sins implicit to their pigmentation and genitalia? Confess your white by proxy sins, you vile white male. This was written back in 2008. Who's the prophet? Whereas I have never shared personal information in a previous academic review, it might be instructive to do so in the current case. And by the way, here I was doing so because, of course, I was becoming very aware of how these enemies of reason operate. And of course, I would score very highly on the victimology poker card, and therefore I had to divulge my identity. My family escaped the Middle East at a time when knowledge of our Judaism would have led to our execution. Hence, I have experienced the most virulent and true forms of hatred, subjugation, and racism. My life hung in the balance. Hence, you might imagine how personally offended I might have felt when I read the following sentence on page XXX. And basically the sentence says, you know how horrible it is, for someone to get a Band-Aid and for it to not be in the correct shade. Boo-hoo-hoo. Anyways, hence, while the hatred that I was exposed to in my childhood would have led to my execution, the author provides examples of racism in the form of Band-Aids and stockings that should, quote, come in all flesh tones. It is unbearable to read such rubbish from authors who sit on top of their academic ivory tower pretending to fight against racism. Identity politics and related victimology research have no place in scientific discourse. Written in 2008. One final point. I am in no way questioning the existence of racism in the United States, nor am I minimizing its effects on particular individuals. That notwithstanding, none of the ideological positions taken in this paper is veridical. There you have it, folks. I've been fighting this for more than 2 decades. I'm now very glad that an increasing number of people in academia are joining me in this fight. If you'd like to support us, share our work, support us on Patreon, support us on PayPal. You can find links to my accounts on this channel. If you do nothing other than share my work, then you're already contributing to the battle of ideas. Hope you're having a good Saturday. I'll talk to you soon. Ciao.